Hello, everyone. Dr. Christine Smith, practitioners. And I was just making sure my technology was working correctly. So yes, hello everybody. Today we are going to be talking with Kiran Krishnan, who is a microbiologist, and he is the Chief Scientific Officer for Microbiome Labs, which is a really cool company that specializes in probiotics. So I am going to go ahead and invite him on. There we go. Pop on any second. So a lot of what we've been talking about, right, is all of this stuff around gut health and brain health and how they can create these inflammatory cascades that can ultimately affect the rest of the body. And this can have to do with like our microbiome affecting how our body produces insulin. It can have to do with how we process our hormones and if we're actually detoxing our hormones correctly. Our microbiome can contribute to our levels of inflammatory chemicals of all different kinds throughout the body. So it's really a contributor to almost just about every health condition. I wouldn't call it the cause of every health condition, but it is involved in almost every health condition. So hi, Kiran, how are you doing?
Hi, good. How are you? It took a while to load, so I wasn't sure if you were seeing me yet, but great to join you. Thank you for
Yes,
having me.
absolutely. Thank you for joining us. So, yeah, I would love to talk to you today about some of the stuff that you were talking about at your wonderful seminar that I got to attend to. And I'd love if you could just give your own introduction to everybody about who you are and how you ended up here and your interests and all of that.
Yeah, I would love to. Hello everybody. So I'm Kiran Krishnan. I'm the Chief Science Officer and co-founder of Microbiome Labs. My background is as a research microbiologist. My interest for the longest time has been on gut commensal microbes and understanding the microbiome. And of course, we develop a lot of tools and we do a lot of research around how do we modulate or work with the microbiome to reduce our risk of issues, health issues in general, right? And now we know, because of the time that we live in and the very exciting time that we live in, that the vast majority of chronic illnesses trace back to some sort of dysfunction in the ecosystem of the microbiome, right? That seems to be the root cause of things. And when we think about holistic health and integrative medicine and so on, everything is directed towards root cause understanding. And so we're in an amazing pole position to help, doctors like Christine and others that are out there on the front lines trying to improve people's health, to give you guys the tools and the understanding that you need on what constitutes a root cause driver and what can you do about it. So I'm excited to be able to be here. I've focused a lot of the last 7-8 years of work on leaky gut, and how impactful that is across the board, on everything, including, of course, the brain. So excited to be able to talk about any and all of it.
Absolutely. That's perfect. Thank you. So, and when he talks about leaky gut, this is kind of the foundation of everything
Hmm.
that we've talked about and that I've been talking about on my channel, right? And it's
Yeah.
this situation that our body gets into where basically our stress capacity has been maxed out. And then our gut starts to respond to that. And that stress capacity can have to do with mental stresses and how we stress ourselves out in society. It can have to do with pathogens from the environment, maybe picking up some accidental infection. It can have to do with environmental toxic exposures, like all the pollution that we deal with. So, like, for example, why we should not eat pesticides. So a lot
Hmm.
of people are unaware that the way that pesticides work is they kill the insect by basically dissolving them from the inside out and
Hmm.
dissolving their intestines. So why we didn't think that this would happen to us, I'm not quite sure why, but I'm sure Kiran can touch more on like the mechanism behind that.
Yeah.
Because as this happens and we get these little pieces of our gut that get damaged, just like any other part of our body, but then we heal. It's just sometimes that healing gets incapacitated, and then we get to a point where it's overwhelming, and we start to get these particles that are not supposed to be in our bloodstream accidentally leaking through and then kind of wrecking havoc. And this is where he is awesome at explaining the mechanisms behind that.
Yeah, and I'm glad you bring up pesticides, and herbicides fall into that same category as well, right? And that kind of it, the prevalence and presence of those in the marketplace, and the assumption that they're safe, is actually a great example of working in a vacuum of information, right? Because at that time, when many of these compounds were approved back in the 70s and 80s, we didn't know that the microbiome existed, right? And we didn't know that the microbiome had any impact alone on our health, let alone the existence of it at all. And so, like, take herbicides, for example, right? That, like, Roundup, it works on something called the shikimate pathway. And the shikimate pathway is an amino acid metabolism pathway that lower order plants and some pests have and they utilize. So it's a biochemical pathway in their system, in their cells. And this compound interferes with that pathway, and so it kills the cell and kills the organism. The assumption on safety is that the human cell doesn't use the shikimate pathway for amino acid metabolism or synthesis. And so the thinking was that, well, human cells don't use this pathway, or low order weeds and pests do. So this is a perfectly safe compound for humans. Forgetting, of course, that, or at least at that time, not realizing that we have this massive treasure trove of microbes that live within us, most of which use the shikimate pathway, right? So the way in which we target these pests and these herbs is the exact same way in which we can target and end up killing our microbes that play a very significant role, of course, in our health. And now we're starting to realize that, right? So we didn't know that before. So now that we know better, we should be doing better. And that's our whole goal here. And that's why I love what you're doing every single day, putting out education.
Well, and I'm so glad that you're here, right? Like, thank you for doing this. I know you're a really busy person and speak a lot. So this is fantastic because this is how people start to learn how to take care of their own health and when different things can play different roles. So I had two questions pop up, and one of them was, can leaky gut be mistaken for brain fog? I'm going to let you go wild on that one. And then the other one was, can it be mistaken for Crohn's disease? And I will just argue with the statement that I don't think they're separate.
Absolutely. So think about leaky gut as an underlying driver of all of these things, right? So if your gut is leaky, what we've described before, and you've described many times on your channel as well, that it allows for things that shouldn't be in circulation to leak through the lining of the gut and end up in circulation. And because of that, it creates a significant amount of chronic low-grade inflammation throughout the body. And it does so in the brain, it does so in the joints, it does so in your heart, lungs, and so on. Everywhere in your body, it creates inflammation. And inflammation is the foundation of disease, right? And so dysfunction and disarray in the body is largely driven by inflammation. So is leaky gut associated with those things? Leaky gut is likely the driver of those things. And if you think about Crohn's, for example, some of the pathways are the dysfunctioning within the microbiome that leads to leakiness in the gut are very similar to the dismantling of the microbiome that can lead to Crohn's and colitis and other forms of inflammatory bowel conditions. It all starts with dismantling the balance within your gut microbiome of microbes that build and maintain the lining of the gut versus microbes that eat away and destroy the lining of the gut, right? So what's interesting about people's microbiomes, we all know now from all the information that the microbiome is so critical to our health. But what we have to keep in mind is that your microbiome can either be the best thing that's working for you, making you resilient, healthy, live long and all that, or it can be the most toxic thing that you're exposed to every single day, right? So it's on one of those two ends of the spectrum. And of course, somewhere in the middle is where we can make progress. But at the end of the day, if you're not focusing on those microbes in your microbiome, they're likely working against you every minute of every day.
Ooh, so I just had another great question come up. So I saw the same question come up a few times. So just, how do you know if you have leaky gut? Usually if you're experiencing some of the symptoms that we're talking about, things like brain fog or skin irritations or allergies,
intolerances of anything.
Yes, that usually means you're dealing with some abnormal levels of inflammation that need to be addressed. So one of the other questions that popped up, which I think is a great question, is what to think about and what is happening when you sometimes need to take a large dose of antibiotics, because sometimes that can be incredibly helpful, but the we'll just say like the battlefield that it can leave behind can sometimes really need some nurturing. So I'd love if you would touch on that too.
Yeah, and that's something we've studied as well. So we published a paper, I think it was in 2020, looking at, number one, what happens when you look really at the cellular level from the microbial perspective at antibiotic treatment in the gut? And then can you recover the gut, or at least protect the gut to some degree from that, right? And like you said, there are absolutely times when you have to take an antibiotic and it's the most appropriate action to save your life or stave off a real serious condition. But you can absolutely both protect and recover the ecosystem from that, right? So microbes and your microbiome likes to tend to get to a homeostasis, right? It's like any other ecosystem where the ecosystem wants to have a high degree of diversity and a high degree of competition within the ecosystem. So most stable ecosystems in the world have balance, they have good and bad things, and they have competition among all of the factors, right? And that competition maintains certain degree of stability. We've also translated that to economic markets and all that stuff, where people talk about where balance and stability comes about from healthy competition. So what things like antibiotics tend to do is tend to change the competitive landscape of the gut for one type of organism versus another, right? So they disrupt by actually ending up favoring certain organisms versus another. And let me explain what tends to happen there, because then people can visualize and understand, okay, what's happening when I take the antibiotic. So imagine, you've got all of these organisms sitting up here, all of their levels are pretty high, you've got pretty good diversity. They're all kind of competing with each other a little bit, but maintaining stability. One of the key factors in maintaining the right type of diversity within your gut microbiome is the level of pH in your gut, right? The largest parts of your gut, like a slightly acidic, just under neutral type of pH. And then as you get more closer to the stomach, the pH comes lower and lower and lower. So there's a gradient of pH that's maintained within your gut. Now, if the pH gets thrown off, if the level of acidity in the gut gets thrown off, it favors certain organisms over the other, right? So some organisms grow really well at a pH of 7, others grow much better at a pH of 4. So knowing that, what tends to happen is the microbes that produce acid in your stomach create a very balanced competitive environment. A lot of these are lactic acid producing bacteria. So you take a dose of antibiotics. On the first pill that you take, within a couple hours, 90% of all those microbes are killed, right? Now, representatives of each one still remain at very, very low levels. It's actually really hard to kill off any given microbe 100%, right? And that's why all of those cleaners and all that are antimicrobials all say kills 99.9% of all bacteria, because it's very hard to verify that you can kill 100%. So they all have representatives of themselves. Now that all of them are knocked down, all of the lactic acid producing bacteria are also knocked down. So now there's less lactic acid and the pH starts to go up, right? So it's less acidic. Now, as the microbes start to come back and they start to grow back, the ones that do better at a slightly higher pH tend to come back a little bit faster, right? So now there's this imbalance, and then all of them get knocked down again. And then these guys already come back faster next time, and they get all knocked back again. And it keeps seeing this big delta between the microbes that like higher pH versus microbes that don't. So that's kind of the simple ecological forces that are happening when you are taking an antibiotic. So if you want to protect against this imbalance that occurs on regrowth, one of the key things you would want to do is bring in microbes during the course of antibiotics that are stable and functional in the presence of those antibiotics that continue to acidify your gut, right? They continue to produce lactic acid so that if everything gets knocked down, they kind of come back up at the ratio that they were before, right? And so you can use probiotics. We use a spore-based probiotics to do that, the Megaspore, and restore flora and HU period. And then after the course of antibiotics is done, then you'd want to do diet, prebiotics, probiotics, and so on, and throw everything at it to compete against microbes that may have overgrown during that period, and then also support the growth of microbes that are beneficial, that may have an underrepresentation now because of that force, right? So, and this is true for almost anything that you put into your system. If you think about how does this change the ecosystem or the forces within the ecosystem, right? Roundup, pesticides, herbicides is one of those that screws up a certain types of bacteria within the gut and allows for others to flourish. All our lifestyle choices, stress is a great example of that too. Stress is one of those things that screws up the ecological forces in the gut and destabilizes the environment.
That was an amazing explanation. I loved that. Thank you.
Thank you.
And, you know, I keep seeing questions pop up as we're talking where it's like, well, what about this condition? What about this specific condition? And what about this specific condition? And what about mold? And like, maybe that's the cause. And I just want to shift everyone's paradigm a little bit and how you are perceiving how your body works. I think we've been very much trained to believe that there's one cause to one condition. And that's generally how our system looks at it. Versus, if I go back to what I said at the beginning about your body has reached its stress threshold, I think that's the best way to think about it. Another term for that is called allostatic load. It means like the overall stress load that your body is taking on. So if you are having like a super duper stressful week, it may mean that you have less tolerance that week to cheat on foods that you might be sensitive to. If you're having an okay week, you might be more tolerant of it that week. And if you're dealing with an autoimmune condition, there's usually a lot of other things involved, and leaky gut is usually a part of it. It may have been the instigator in the beginning, depending on what caused you to reach your stress threshold, or it may have resulted of something else that happened, like if you encountered mold, because yeah, mold can absolutely contribute to leaky gut because of all the toxins that you're dealing with and then the stress load that it puts on your body. And so basically it's like all of these big cycles interplay together and all of our organ systems interplay together. And this is why leaky gut can be tied to Hashimoto's, or leaky gut can be tied to RA, just like he was saying a few minutes ago, where it like the leakiness causes little particles from the bacteria that your body's trying to protect you from to leak through into your bloodstream where they're not supposed to be. And then it activates your entire immune system. And the other part of this is when all this gets activated, your gut is also trying to protect you. So it also upregulates its immune system. But also your gut is where your immune cells go to become educated about how to function. So if your gut is super inflamed for a long period of time and your immune cells are turning over, but they're going to your gut to become educated about how to operate, they're going to tend to operate in more inflammatory styles in your body. And this is how our immune systems slowly get upregulated over time, and why it can take a lot of work and patience and diligence to reverse those conditions, which is, I mean, if you get the inflammation and allostatic load in your body under control, you can make a real impact on those diagnoses. And and that's where it's really helpful to work with a practitioner, right? Because that's where I was talking about food sensitivities, and I'm sure Kiran can speak more to this, but like I'll have people come in all the time with like migraines, right? And they think that it's all a musculoskeletal thing, which like sometimes it is. But I can't tell you how many times I've had someone cut out gluten and their migraines go away. And it's a fascinating topic. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, and and I want to address something that you said, I think, which is so important for people, is that paradigm shift in understanding some of the foundations of the disease process, right? Because it doesn't actually matter as much what your condition is labeled as, right? Whether you have this autoimmune disease versus this autoimmune disease versus this one, right? You might go, oh, I don't really care about lupus because I'm really concerned about thyroiditis or Hashimoto's. Well, the pathologies that drive both of those conditions are the same. They're the underlying things, but there's a number of other factors which dictate whether or not you ended up with Hashimoto's or whether you end up with lupus, right? But the underlying dysfunction is the same in both cases. The lecture I did at the PLMI, I do like a 2-hour version of that where I go through all of these seemingly unrelated diseases, and we certainly wouldn't look at them as related in a traditional sense, but they all have the same underlying driver, right? And one of the analogies I give people is that, like, if you get a cut on your hand, right, and there's many ways of getting a cut on your hand, but either way, it ends up with a break in the skin. If you left it alone, which means you provided that part of your body the environment in which to heal, right? In fact, if it's a really big wound, you want it to be moist. And there's some good research around like maintaining moisture in the wound actually heals better and pulling out the exudate to some certain degree. So certain parameters to maintain this an environment, and the wound will heal on its own. But if you keep irritating that, every morning you wake up, you rub it and you scratch it and you irritate it, it's never going to heal, right? It's going to remain a cut to some degree or the other. And that's kind of what's happening in the body, right? So you create an underlying foundation where disease can occur. Then there are other factors that trip one after the other that cause a particular condition. So now you have this condition. And then unless you deal with the underlying factor and change the environment around this condition, it doesn't have the opportunity to heal because you continuously irritate the condition, right? So leaky gut can become anxiety, depression, Alzheimer's. It can also become SIBO, which are seemingly unrelated, right? People are going, what does bloating have to do with neurological loss in my brain? It's absolutely the same pathology, where that starts the process, right? And then what other factors you have going on will either make it more of a SIBO-like condition or more of an anxiety-like condition. But the underlying factor is what we're so concerned about, right? Because in the standard American gut and the standard American diet, we have this amazing foundation for disease, and everything around us hurts our microbiome, right? Almost everything we do in modern lifestyle has negative impact or at least no positive impact on the microbiome. And the microbiome controls the vast majority of our immune system, the lining of the gut, our ability to digest and process foods. Of course, most of our genetics are in our microbiome. So we keep coming back to that foundational thinking, right? That we really have to think about the foundations and the terrain. And when you can modulate those, you can make progress on disease.
Yes, absolutely. And, I just happened to be hanging out with one of my favorite people today who happens to be a Stanford neurologist who's an MD, because I saw a lot of people asking like, well, why does everyone just prescribe antibiotics? And like, why don't we do this? And how do I find the right doctor? The answer is it's hard. And sometimes antibiotics are needed, but also sometimes the people prescribing them just haven't done that form of education yet. And their system teaches them in a different way. And like all of this knowledge that I'm sharing with you right now, I learned by completely on my own, continuing education outside 100%. Of graduate school, outside of my degree. I didn't get any credits for going to Kiran's seminar. I went because I wanted to learn. And like, those are the doctors that you're going to seek, are the ones who are learning, and they sometimes are in the functional medicine realm. But I would love to hear if Dr. Amelia Barrett has any thoughts on this whole gut thing and migraines and how they play into each other, if she wants to drop in her 2 cents, because she developed an entire program for helping people get rid of migraines with lifestyle and nutrition and yoga.
That's awesome.
Hey, everybody. Well, I really view this as the future of medicine, and I think that this represents an area where one day there will be unity in how we handle these problems. Right now, there's not. Right now, there's kind of the MD way when it comes to neurology that mostly revolves around prescription medications. Unfortunately, that fails a large number of people. Millions of people are in chronification, and they need different answers. And oftentimes, I agree with you, the answer can lie in the gut. My experience, though, is with people who come in and they want me to give them a pill and make them all better. And I tell them, hey, you've got a dairy allergy. And they're like, no, I don't.
It's the hardest conversation I have with patients is coffee, dairy, and bread.
Yeah,
exactly. Yep. So I can certainly foresee a future where, people will get an antibiotic and then somebody else will say, okay, here's what you need to be doing during the antibiotic. Here's what you need to do after the antibiotic to help your body heal.
We should be working together.
Yes, unity. There's so much wisdom in everybody's different traditions. But I think that, there are probably certain segments in neurology that are starting to catch on to this whole gut-brain axis idea. And we're going to see more of that as time goes on, because people are going to get better. And so as people get those results, that will become more incorporated in our practices.
Yep. And I just saw a comment that says, wow, get rid of migraines. So Dr. Amelia, what is this cool course that you have for helping people get rid of migraines called, and how can they find it?
Well, it's about, it's targeted for people for whom conventional medicine has not served them. For people who are still having several headaches or can't tolerate medications. And so what we do is we use all of the advances in technology to help people. So that may be genetic testing, that may be functional lab testing. And then we bring in a lot of high-tech solutions, whether that's wearables, teach people how to manage whatever it is that we're finding that's going on in their body. But it's very much focused on figuring out, why are my migraines happening and how do I make them stop? Triptans are great, got nothing against medications, but for a lot of people, what they want is, why is this happening in the first place? And so that's what I help people do.
Yep. And she and I actually did a whole other talk, if you want to explore the posts on my page, about this entire topic. And then I think she has the link for her stuff if you're interested in her account, which is just Dr. Amelia Barrett, right? And
yeah, probably the easiest way to get information. So it's all based on how the brain heals. And so you can learn more about that science at migraineclass.com, which is migraineclass.com.
And what were when last time we were talking, you listed, and this is kind of goes with what Kiran and I are talking about, right? Like you listed, I think it was 4 major things that you like to address and that a lot of people skip. And one of them is like detoxification. So what are those 4 things you usually address that you like?
Yeah, I call it the Reboot Your Brain Protocol, which is a 4-step process. The first is to reveal where your body and your brain are at with labs. Second is to revitalize. Obviously, we correct any nutrient deficiencies, support you with food and nutraceuticals. And third is remove, which is the detox step. And this is an incredibly important and emerging part of how we're helping people heal. The medicine is far behind the science of understanding the impact of the chemicals in our world, like you were talking about with the glyphosate. But we know how the body detoxes. And I personally think we all need to know how to detox our bodies so that we can get some of this stuff out, because it helps everything, not just headaches. And then the last step is rewire. The brain is a creature of habit, and it becomes wired to make headaches easily. And we know from functional MRI how to help you rewire back to those normal, healthy firing patterns. So that's a key part of healing too.
Thank you so much. This was perfect. I'm so glad you're here today.
Cool, yeah.
Excellent. So this is why I just kind of wanted to like ask her 2 cents, right? This plays back into exactly what Kiran and I are talking about is, and she's from a traditional medically trained background, and she's just knowledgeable about these things. So when people are asking like how to find those doctors, unfortunately, you just kind of have to look around a little bit, and functional is usually helpful. But that's why I do these things and why I bring people like her in, so that you can find them. So this is how you find them. And then back to like what Kiran was talking about, all of this plays back to the gut, right? Because when you have leaky gut, it is also likely that you probably have a leaky blood-brain barrier. And I would love, Kiran, if you could talk about that a little bit, because I know many of the questions that have been coming up are around how your gut affects brain health in particular.
Yeah, and it's super interesting when you look, for example, at the development of the gut and the brain, and the development of the enteric nervous system, which covers obviously the entire digestive tract and considered really the second brain in many ways. The development from an embryonic stage are running in parallel. They basically develop from the same region of the embryo, and then the types of cellular differentiation that go into forming the gut, the brain barrier are exactly the same in terms of physiology and structure as a gut barrier, and they're regulated in very similar ways as well. And we know that bacterial byproducts, at least in utero, are really important for the development of the gut lining, but also equally important for the brain lining. One example is peptidoglycans. These peptidoglycans are made by commensal bacteria in the gut, and they're released into circulation. And then the placenta actually has receptors and carriers for bacterial peptidoglycan, and takes those to the baby's brain in utero, and that initiates a blood-brain barrier development. It initiates synaptogenesis. It does helps with myelination, and all of these really important factors around healthy neurons, healthy brains, and some of that has been outsourced to bacterial byproducts. Right. So if you think about it, arguably some of the most important development we want to happen to the baby's brain in utero is the proper development of the central nervous system in the brain. Right. And that we've outsourced in part to microbes. And so that relationship between us and microbes cannot be overstated, because we don't have the genetic capability to do anywhere close to the types of functions that we need to do to be human, right? With our 23,000 measly genes that we tend to have in our chromosomes, yet we have 2.5 million microbial genes in our system to assist with the vast majority of biochemical, biological function. So the control of the brain barrier, the control of the gut barrier are very similar. If something disrupts the tight junctions in the gut, it's going to disrupt the tight junctions in the brain, and the immune system plays a very significant role in that as well. Thinking of the gut as a central command center for the peripheral immune system, when the gut is disrupted, the peripheral immunity also gets disrupted, right? Like what you were talking about the immune tutoring, how these cells that circulate around the dendritic cells, macrophages, and so on, they keep coming to the gut to learn and get tutored and proliferate, and then they go to the periphery to conduct their function. But if they leave the gut with the wrong information, they're going to attack all the wrong things when they get in the periphery, right? And that has an impact on the brain as well.
Absolutely. And I keep seeing questions. So people are like, well, is the gut tied to this? And is the gut tied to that? And, what about this condition? And I think the best answer that I can give you is tied to it. Yes. Mm-hmm. Involved in some way, likely. The cause of it, I don't know without further testing, but involved, most likely. So if you have some kind of condition and you don't know where to start, working on your gut health is a great place to start, because it will usually regulate a lot of other things, because so much is processed through there, including things like hormones. And so like if you have, someone asked about constipation too, right? Is constipation leaky gut? Yes, technically. If you're not pooping correctly, it's because your microbiome is dysfunctioning, and you likely probably have some leakiness in there too. And if you're not pooping correctly, then you're never going to be able to detox correctly, which means that you actually hold on to your hormones and retain hormones that you're not supposed to have. And so there's a whole bunch of things tied into there, but I'm going to bring you back to that paradigm shift and that concept of allostatic load and the overall stress load on your body. So it's just usually an accumulation of things, but the gut is usually involved. And then I see other questions about like, no dairy, no bread ever for the rest of my life. I'm going to bring it back to the allostatic load thing, right? Because it depends. It depends on where you're at. For myself, I consider bread and dairy and sugar a treat. It is a treat for me. And I am aware that it usually causes some inflammation in my body. But if I'm in a place where my body can handle it, then sometimes I'll do it, because I think, you've got to live your life and enjoy it. Like, that's the whole point. But if enjoying it through eating bread and dairy means that you like break out in a horrible rash and have terrible brain fog and are just a grumpy pants all the time, that's not really enjoying it. So maybe you might actually enjoy life more if you just regulate your diet a little bit, but it completely shifts how you're feeling inside. And so that's a lot of where we work with people, and why different things don't always work for the same people, and why you need different things. And this is why I really like Kiran's company, or the Microbiome Labs that he's talking for, is because they really focus on like the different needs that people have. And I'm going to let him touch more on that in a second. But I want to talk about like why some people might be sensitive to dairy and why some people aren't. And it, again, comes back to that load thing. So if you have like a little bit of leaky gut, and then maybe you ate like a bunch of bread when you had leaky gut, and your body reacted to a lot of the bread particles, and that can be gluten, and it can also be other peptide breakdowns. So like you might seem like you're okay to oats, but once you break the oat down, the peptide that it's made of, you might be sensitive to those individual peptides, and then that can create the entire inflammatory response again. So this is why it's so confusing and hard, and it is hard to do like an elimination diet. It takes some discipline, but you can do it. But then the lab testing is helpful because you can figure out what state your body is in at that time. And then I don't tell people like, hey, you can never have these foods again for the rest of your life. It's just like, hey, right now, well, you're in this healing stage, because the first thing I do is stop lighting your body on fire. I will have you not eat these foods for a period of time until you're less sensitive to them. And then we can bring them back in. And it depends on how intensely you're healing, right? If you just have like some mild symptoms and it's not that big of a deal, you're probably going to go pretty quick. And like 3 months will probably do the trick. If you're dealing with like a chronic autoimmune condition, it might be something that you have to do over the course of a few years. And like, yes, you can kind of like cheat here and there, but that's the real answer. And I'm just going to be realistic with you. Like, it takes time, and your symptoms might go away and you'll be feeling really good, and you start to bring stuff back in, and then they sort of creep back up. And that just lets you know that you're still like kind of close to your threshold, and it might take you a little longer. So this is a lot of what I teach people about. It's like how to read your body. And if you guys want, like I do a lot of group courses for people and stuff sometimes. So if that's of interest to you to have support while you go through like a lifestyle change like this, you can click on the link in my bio and I will take you to a little wait list I have, and I'll get your email. And then when I have a space, I'll shoot you an email and I can include you in that. And then I'm working on turning that into a course that's pre-recorded that you can just do yourself at home too. But I like the group aspect because I think community is something else that we're totally missing in healthcare. And it gets really lonely feeling like you're the only person with a gut thing or with food sensitivities, or where you're like, I'm allergic to everything, what do I do? And sometimes it's nice to be able to like work with other people during that and have some support. But anyway, I want to come back to what I was mentioning and with Kiran here and ask, like, what are your thoughts on the order that people need to do things in for healing? Because you're talking about kind of laying a foundation. And then I know sometimes, like if someone's really irritated, you have to be kind of careful about the probiotics that they take because you can actually make things worse. So it's all about the order that you do it in. So I'm going to let you talk on that.
Yeah, and I think this, ties into the allosteric load that you're talking about, right? Because really, at the end of the day, the way I view health is about building resilience, where you can make some of the wrong decisions. You can be exposed to certain things that aren't necessarily good for you, but your body can handle it. It can handle that level of stress, that level of load, and protect you from it, recover from it, and you're perfectly fine, right? And so when you're thinking about things in that way, when you start the process of healing, it becomes really important to reduce the amount of stressors that are impacting your system, right? Again, going back to that cut that can heal if you leave it alone and let it be in the right condition. The stressor is like something rubbing on it every single day, right? So it becomes really hard to heal when you're continuously generating inflammation and all that in your body,
It's a perfect way to say it.
Yeah, and so number one, let's start reducing or reducing the exposure to the things that drive stress and load in your body. Toxigenic stress, psychosocial, motor stress, all of those things, right? Just like if you had a really strong workout yesterday, you wouldn't go back in the gym today and work out the same muscles. They need to rest, right? So you could think of yourself as being in this place where, okay, I need to modulate the stressors that are aggravating my system. Once you start being able to identify those stressors, and working with a practitioner is a great way of doing that, because there's ways of testing things that may be stressing your system, right? As you reduce those stressors, then you start looking at how do you start modulating the microbes, right? Because the microbes themselves can be a very significant source of the stressor, right? Because if you have too much of certain microbes, they may produce toxins and things. They may be eliciting immune responses that are unfavorable in your system. So you need to start looking at ways of balancing those microbes. And the best ways to do it are things like starting to modulate your diet as much as you can. So there's a dual modulation happening in your brain. You're removing things to a certain degree that cause stress in your system, but then you want to try to add things that help feed the microbes in a positive way, right? You can even add things like fasting, intermittent fasting, right? Not feeding the system, allowing the system to rest for a bit, and allowing other housekeeping type genes to turn on during that process. Using the right type of probiotics. One of the things we loved about the spores is we've been able to demonstrate and publish their ability to modulate the microbiome.
Oh yeah, why don't you expand on the spores a little bit? It's really cool.
Yeah, so one of the ways that we came to the idea of using the spores as a therapeutic is because of all of the data that exists since the early 1950s on the use of the spores as competitive exclusion agents, right? So the most well-known story of the spores is the discovery of their use in North Africa. So during World War II, the German army, when they were in North Africa, would realize that, the vast majority of the soldiers are dying from dysentery rather than any sort of battle. And what they realized was that the locals, when they would get sick, they would actually consume dried camel dung as a way of treating their gut. And so there was a big research project that initiated in Europe, where they took a bunch of dried camel dung to figure out what is it within this dried camel dung that was acting as a antimicrobial agent, if you will, and they identified bacillus. And at that time it was Bacillus subtilis. There might have been a clausi that they identified as well. And so, sure enough, a few years after that, they launched a drug called Enterogermina that has been in the market since 1952, specifically for treating things like dysentery and other gut infections. Because these spores, these bacterial endospores that are ubiquitous in nature, there are a certain number of these spores that also can live in the gut, right? So they have this really interesting biphasic life cycle where they live in the outside environment. They can be in the dirt and sand and waters and rivers and streams and sitting on your fruits and vegetables outside. And they can also live in the anaerobic or facultative environment in the gut. And so when they get in the gut, though, they do something called quorum sensing, where they read the microbial signatures that are present, and they'll identify pathogenic or dysfunctional organisms, and they'll sit next to them, and they'll essentially compete for nutrients, or they may even produce antimicrobials to kill off those pathogens. And then they'll produce compounds like subtilicin, which acts as an antimicrobial for dysfunctional bacteria, but acts as a prebiotic for many of our important commensals. So they can actually shift and change the balance within your microbiome in a relatively short amount of time. They're kind of like the gut police, the orchestrators of the biome. And what's interesting about that, when you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, right, it's kind of an example of symbiogenesis, of our ability to work within our environment and work with organisms to perpetuate the health of both, right? So what it seems like the evolutionary agreement that we've achieved with these bacillus spores is that we give them a home, so our immune system tolerates them, perfectly allows them to exist. In fact, they're very good at kind of stimulating B cell and T cell proliferation in our mesenteric lymph nodes. But we tolerate them, we work well with them, and at the same time, they kind of clean up our home, right? So they know ways to actually identify problematic bacteria. I'll give you a great example of that. We published a study with Cleveland Clinic on C. diff, on Clostridium difficile infection. And it was so fascinating to learn how these spores, these probiotic spores, actually targeted C. diff. What they actually do is they identify and find Clostridium, they will surround the Clostridium difficile, and then they actually produce a chelating agent to steal minerals away from the Clostridia, especially iron. And Clostridia need iron as an important part of its metabolic process. Hence, it digs through your intestinal layers to try to get to the blood flow, which is why people with C. diff infection have bloody diarrhea, right? They're eating away at the lining to get to the blood flow. And so the spores are so intelligent that they figured out a way to surround these microbes, steal the iron away from them, starve out the C. diff, kill it, as effective as vancomycin does as an antibiotic, right? But without harming anything else in the region, right? And that's just the beauty and elegance of biology. You know, you couldn't give me 100 of the top microbiologists in the world and an endless budget to design a bacteria that does that, right? That's just the beauty of millions of years of evolution and symbiogenesis with nature. So that's why we utilize these bacterial spores, and there's other agents like that in the natural world that have been modulating our microbiome for us for millennia. You know, and we just have to be smart enough to identify that they exist, test them, understand how they work, and then utilize them, right? We can't outsmart and re-engineer nature in that way. So that's why we divert to the spores, because they do such amazing things.
That was really cool history and information. I love that you know that. Thank you. So, I mean, this is why the gut is such a big deal, right? And it's like any condition I talk about, I'm usually going to end up talking to you about your gut too. Even if you sprain your ankle, did you guys know that you can get leaky gut from a sprained ankle? Yeah, it's true. Anytime that you get an injury, it stresses your body out and you get leaky gut, which is why it's so important to be careful with your diet after you've had some kind of injury, even like a fender bender, car accident, same difference. So this is a time when your body is more vulnerable and a time when you can help and kind of supplement it. And then using things like he's talking about can be really helpful when you are recovering from, you know, having to take a dose of antibiotics, because sometimes they're life-saving. And so that kind of stuff is just amazing. And for the question, he was talking about a specific type of bacillus spore that can really be helpful for killing off C. diff. And that is something that their company works with. And, you know, people are asking for, well, what's the best probiotic and what's the specific recommendation for this? That's not something that we can answer here, because it's really different for everybody. And so it depends on what's going on with your body and what you need, because if your gut is super duper inflamed because, let's say, you like went through divorce and then you got mold exposure and you've been super stressed out, I might not be able to give you a probiotic right away because it might actually make your system angry. So like really, I might need to work on healing your gut lining. Same thing if you just took a bunch of antibiotics, right? Like I might need to heal your gut lining first and foremost so that we can get some of the like inflammation down and some of the immune reactivity down. And then we can introduce the good guys, which is why I was asking him about what order is important. And if you guys are just tuning in, you can watch the recording later and zoom back and listen to his description because it was excellent. So I know you're a very busy person and we're hitting about the 45-minute mark. Are there any other things that you just like wished people knew about this or that you have been your favorite things to learn?
Yeah, I think one thing is a general kind of a general knowledge thing to keep in mind, and I think this is what kind of underscores why we all live in a very exciting time, right? So the kind of the discovery and the research around the microbiome is revealing a whole other way in which humans are actually formed and function. And it's arguably, we could say that the last 100 years of medical and scientific research has really only focused on 10% or less of the human system until you start looking at the microbiome. That's where probably the rest of the 90% is, right? And what's so exciting about that is that the vast majority of chronic illnesses, even things that are seemingly incurable right now, like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, dementia, right? Very scary conditions that are seemingly incurable. All of those conditions will likely have a microbiome therapeutic in the future that is really effective, whether it's preventative or a treatment. So we live in a very exciting time. We're finally understanding what the human system looks like and how it functions. And there's a lot of hope. And I think that's a key component of it, right? Because people may be suffering with things right now, or they feel like they have a risk of something to suffer because they saw their parents go through it, and they feel a sense of hopelessness because your doctor may not have the answer for you right now. There isn't a pill to fix it, right? But know that when you add all of these things together, the diet modifications, the lifestyle choices, the right supplements, the right nutrition, all of those things, they all make a big difference. And they all can dramatically impact your outcomes. And all of that is within your control. So there's a lot of hope. There's a lot that you can do yourself by listening to programs like this and getting educated on it and empowering yourself to be able to make that change. And so it's really exciting to be around, but let's get educated, let's have that knowledge, and then let's start making these tiny steps and these little decisions, right? So every little choice you make, what you put in your mouth, on your body, surround yourself with, all of those things will add up and they all matter. So, but it's all within your control.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Like so much of health is lifestyle. And that's basically what I do in my work, right? I just help people figure out lifestyles that work for them. And then I'll do some lab testing and like help with some supplements along the way. But I try to be kind of a minimalist because I really want people to be able to manage their own health. Like that's my goal, right? I want the world to be healthier, and I don't want you to have to be dependent on other people because I want you to understand your physiology, which is why I do these things. And I know like originally, the one of the posts that kind of started this whole feed was about insulin and dementia and how they're related. But everything that we've been talking here is an explanation of that. And maybe if you can spare like one more minute, Kiran, you can just give like a quick definition. Because I thought it was so cool when you were talking about how the microbiome affects your insulin production, and then that can play into brain health. And insulin is one piece of brain health, and that you guys can watch my other reel about like insulin degrading enzyme and how if you have high levels of insulin, you actually occupy the molecule that's supposed to break down plaques in your brain. And then I saw a lot of comments of like, oh, well, the plaque thing has been dysregulated for Alzheimer's. You're right. I don't really think plaques are the cause of Alzheimer's. I think they're a side effect of it. And so the cause is exactly what we're talking about here. But yes, I'd love if you touch on the insulin thing before we wrap up.
Yeah, absolutely. So, insulin dysregulation, it speaks to a systemic problem, right? That of course also impacts the brain because we know insulin has a lot of functionality in the brain and regulating, of course, biodynamics in the brain, but then also regulating specific physiology in the brain as well, like synaptogenesis and so on. And so what can happen in the relationship with the gut and that leads to insulin dysregulation is twofold. Number one is inflammation, the chronic low-grade inflammation that arises from intestinal permeability or leaky gut does disrupt organ systems like the pancreas, right? So you can have IL-6 and other inflammatory cytokines that over time cause dysregulation in your body's ability to produce insulin from the pancreas. Number two, a dysregulated gut also dysregulates homeostasis in terms of feeding signals. So when your gut is dysfunctional, what tends to happen is the satiety signals don't make it through. And so what we tend to do is overeat. Our hunger hormone, ghrelin, is constantly high and elevated. And when we have enough food, ghrelin is supposed to come down and leptin is supposed to go up, right? And that shift starts to change the metabolic process in your body from, wanting food and bringing in nutrients to now utilizing nutrients, controlling blood sugar, activating fat burn, and all of the important things that happens. But when your gut is dysregulated, what tends to happen is ghrelin tends to stay high. And you don't get that leptin response the same way. That's called leptin resistance, right? And so not only does that make you susceptible to obesity, but it absolutely makes you susceptible to insulin resistance, right? So then that dysregulates insulin as well, which has an impact of insulin in the brain. Then there's another factor where leakiness in the gut and the associated inflammation from toxins like LPS making their way to the brain and creating inflammation in the brain creates something called central insulin resistance, where now your brain can't read your blood sugar levels anymore because it's inflamed and it's getting damaged, right? And when your brain can't read your blood sugar levels, then your brain can't tell your body to release insulin at the appropriate times and in response to the appropriate stimuli. So now you start developing this insulin resistance and dysregulation, and this is irrespective of your body weight, right? You could be perfectly lean and look quite healthy and still develop insulin resistance at a relatively young age because of the leaky gut dysregulating the brain's ability to read your insulin levels. So there's a multi-pronged approach in where a dysfunctional gut that becomes permeable can dysregulate insulin response in the body. And of course, that becomes the primary insult as produced by the American Diabetic Association, a number of their publications. The primary insult for the development of type 2 diabetes is this intestinal permeability and the resulting endotoxemia. Another study called the CardioPrev study, which looked at 460 patients, I think over 60 months, they found that the only biomarker that was predictive of the development of type 2 diabetes from pre-diabetic risk is the presence of this endotoxin LPS from a permeable intestine, right? So the fact that this process, this pathology creates significant risk for type 2 diabetes and insulin resistance, and also the same pathology is present in creating inflammation and damage in the brain, makes dementia, Alzheimer's, and a form of type 3 diabetes, essentially. It's merely a progression of the same dysfunction that had started a number of years ago, right? And so to me, it's all, again, connected to this underlying driver. And if you can arrest and actually, claw back some of those underlying drivers, you may be able to stop some of those processes. And that's a really exciting area of research for me because, diabetes is a massive epidemic that's coming, right? We know now that there's 4 times more pre-diabetics than currently diabetics, and the vast majority of pre-diabetics are going to be diabetics over the next 15 years, and that's going to be a huge issue. Alzheimer's, dementia, Parkinson's, all prevalence of those are going up and up every year. And to manage those individuals, the diabetic people with dementia and all that, is going to be an amazing task for humanity. And I don't know how we come out of that unless we start looking at this kind of root cause, And so it starts with conversations and programs like this, right?
Absolutely, 100%. And so much of this is lifestyle stuff that you can do at home for free. But if you need some help doing it, that's why we exist. And that's why I do what I do. So again, if you're just tuning in now, if this is something where you would like to make some changes in your life around these aspects, but you need a little bit more like education and maybe some support, I run group programs for this stuff all the time. The link is in my bio, so you can just click on the link and jump on the wait list. And then I'm going to try to make a pre-recorded one that you could do at home on your own time. And then Dr. Amelia has her own pre-recorded course for migraines and how to heal it with lifestyle and yoga. And it was just migraineclass.com, right?
Yep, migraineclass.com to learn the science behind how it works.
Yes. And then Kiran, I believe, has stuff on his own channel channel and Microbiome Labs, and maybe we'll do another one of these in the future. So if you guys have additional questions, I know I missed some. I'm sorry, it's impossible to get everything, but ultimately they're all tied together, right? So no matter what condition you are asking about, this information will serve you. But if you guys have questions or things you want us to address, put them in the comments and I'll include them next time. And then Kiran, if people want to learn more about you and what you're doing, or want to support you or anything like that, where would you direct them?
Yeah, so I joined on here through our Microbiome Labs page. So follow Microbiome Labs. We post a lot of our educational interviews and programs and all that on there. And then also feel free to reach out to me. I'm at Kiran Biome, so KIRANBIOME. I try to engage with people as much as I can as well to provide them some background info, directions, and then I post a lot of my interviews and talks and all that on there as well. So engage and empower yourself with this kind of information.
Absolutely. And I saw people asking, like, will I have names and contacts in the program? It's a completely educational program, not like a patient-based program. So yes, sometimes names are available, but I can always set it to only be first names, whatever makes you feel comfortable. But I usually set you guys up with like a shared feed where you can talk to each other and support each other. So eventually you usually interact. So if that answers that question. So anyway, thank you so much for taking the time to do this today. This was awesome. I love every time I get to talk to you, and I'm sure we could talk about this for like a whole nother hour, but I know you have lots of things to do. So I'll look forward to the next time, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.